A grand conclave station hung in the darkness of space, like a jewel made of light and metal. Spinning slowly at the heart of civilized space, where 4,000 species had gathered for over 1,000,000 years to govern the Milky Way, Galaxy Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood at the entrance of the great chamber, her heart beating fast but her face calm as stone. And she looked at the massive doors that would open in just a few moments to decide the fate of her entire species. Behind her stood 12 other humans, the finest diplomats and scientists Earth had produced, all of them wearing simple dark suits because humanity could not afford the flowing robes and glittering jewelry that other species displayed like peacocks showing their feathers. The doors opened with a sound like thunder rolling across mountains. Elena walked forward into a room so large that clouds actually formed near its ceiling, and she saw thousands of alien representatives sitting in floating platforms that rose like steps toward the heavens, each platform holding creatures of different shapes and colors and sizes. Some had scales that shimmered like oil on water. Others had fur that moved like grass in wind. And some had no solid form at all but existed as clouds of gas or light or something. Elena's mind could not fully understand. At the very top sat the Council of Elders, 7 beings so old that they had seen stars born and die, their bodies wrapped in technology that kept them alive long past their natural time. The eldest among them, a creature called Varax, who looked like a tree made of crystal, spoke first in a voice that echoed through translation devices in every language known to exist. The species known as humanity has requested membership in the Galactic Union, Varax said, and his voice carried the boredom of someone who had done this exact thing 10,000 times before. You may present your case. Elena stepped forward to the speaking platform, a small circle of light in the center of the vast chamber. And she felt very small and very young and very alone, but she had practiced this speech for months, and she believed in every word. Honored elders and representatives of the Galactic Union, she began, her voice steady despite the fear crawling up her spine. Humanity comes before you today, not as conquerors or beggars, but as hopeful neighbors who wish to join the great family of civilized species. She told them about Earth, about the blue oceans and green forests, and the billions of humans who looked up at the stars every night and dreamed of the day they might walk among them. She told them about human history, about their wars and their mistakes, but also about their art and their music and their endless desire to explore and discover and understand. She told them about the 200 years humanity had spent slowly pushing outward from their home world, building colonies on 12 different planets with nothing but their own hands and their own stubborn refusal to give up. We have much to learn from you, Elena said, finishing her speech, but we also have much to offer. And we ask only for the chance to prove ourselves as worthy members of this great union. She stopped speaking and waited. The chamber was silent for exactly 11 seconds. Then Varax made a sound that the translator rendered as a sigh, though it sounded more like glass scraping against stone. The council has deliberated, he announced. And Elena felt her stomach drop, because how could they have deliberated so quickly? The answer is no. Gasps and murmurs rippled through some sections of the chamber, while others made sounds that might have been laughter. Elena stood frozen, unable to speak, as Varax continued. Humanity is too young, having achieved space travel only recently by galactic standards. And your species shows dangerous signs of aggression and unpredictability that make you unsuitable for membership. Another elder spoke, this one a being of pure light that hurt to look at directly. Your genetic structure is unrefined and chaotic, the product of random evolution rather than careful cultivation. And your technology is primitive beyond measure. A third elder, something that looked like a centipede the size of a bus, added its voice to the judgment. you will be permitted to exist within a quarantined sector of space. And you may purchase outdated technology from Union traders at standard rates. And you may send your workers to serve in Union mining operations if you wish to earn currency. You should be grateful, Verax said, and his crystal branches shook in a way that might have been amusement. Many species receive far worse verdicts, and this mercy is extended only because we sense that you might, in several thousand years, evolve into something worth considering again. Elena stood in the circle of light, and she felt the weight of 1,000 alien eyes pressing down on her like physical force. This was the moment. They expected her to beg. This was the moment every rejected species fell to their knees and pleaded for reconsideration, for better terms, for any scrap of approval they could get from the mighty Galactic Union. The other human diplomats behind her were trembling, some with shame and some with rage. But Elena felt something else entirely moving through her blood. She felt clarity. She closed her folder with a soft snap that echoed in the silent chamber. And she looked up at the Council of Elders with an expression that none of the aliens present could quite read. Then she smiled. It was not the smile of someone who had lost. And it was not the smile of someone pretending to accept defeat. And it was not the smile of someone planning revenge. It was the smile of someone who had just learned something very important about the universe. "We understand," Elena said. And her voice was calm and clear and carried no hint of pleading. "Thank you for your clarity." She turned her back on the Council of Elders, something that had not been done in 400,000 years, and she walked toward the exit with her delegation following close behind. Not one of them looked back. The chamber erupted in confusion, with aliens shouting and gurgling and flashing lights at each other in a dozen different forms of communication. But the humans were already gone. Verax watched the doors close behind them, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt something strange stir in his ancient mind. It was not quite worry, and it was not quite fear, but it was something close to both. "They will return," one of the other elders said confidently. "They always return." Verax said nothing, but his crystal branches had stopped shaking, and his light had dimmed just slightly. Elena Vasquez walked through the corridors of the Grand Conclave Station, and she did not speak until her delegation had boarded their ship and sealed the doors behind them. Then she looked at her fellow humans, saw the tears and the anger and the broken hope in their eyes, and she spoke words that would be remembered for centuries. "They have told us who they are," she said quietly. "Now let us show them who we are." The human ship undocked from the station and turned toward home. And it did not send any farewell message, and it did not ask for permission to leave. And it did not look back even once the galaxy had made its judgment. Now humanity would make its own. In the months after the rejection, the Galactic Union watched the borders of human space with the lazy confidence of a giant watching an ant try to climb a mountain. They had seen this story play out 1,000 times before with 1,000 different species, and they knew exactly how it would end. First the humans would be angry, then they would be desperate, and then they would come crawling back to the Union, begging for scraps and willing to accept any terms, just to survive. But the months turned into years, and the years turned into decades, and the humans never came back. Trade Representative Kallax was one of the first to notice something strange, because his job was to manage commerce with the primitive species in the quarantine zones. And humanity had simply stopped buying anything at all. They have not placed a single order in 3 years, Kallax reported to his superiors, his forearms waving in what his species used to show confusion. No technology requests, no resource purchases, no communication of any kind. His superiors told him not to worry, because young species often went through periods of stubborn pride before accepting reality, and the humans would surely break soon enough. They did not break. Instead, Something began happening at the borders of human space that made Union observers very uncomfortable. The colony ships stopped coming out for 200 years. Human vessels had pushed steadily outward from Earth, always exploring, always expanding, always hungry for new worlds and new horizons. But now that hungry expansion had simply stopped like a heart that decided to quit beating. More than that, the human ships that patrolled their borders began turning away anyone who approached. A merchant convoy from the Pelex Trading Guild arrived at the edge of human space, hoping to sell outdated mining equipment at extreme markups, only to be met by a small human patrol craft that broadcast a single message on all frequencies. Human space is closed to outside traffic. Please turn around and do not return. The merchants tried to argue, tried to negotiate, tried to offer better prices and special deals. But the human ship simply repeated its message and waited until they left. When a Union diplomatic vessel was sent to investigate, it found the same thing. "We are not accepting visitors at this time," the automated message said. "All diplomatic inquiries should be submitted in writing and will be reviewed when humanity deems it appropriate." The diplomats submitted their inquiries and received no response. Years passed, and the wall around human space grew thicker, and higher Union scientists aimed their most powerful sensors at human territory, trying to peer through the darkness and understand what was happening inside. And what they saw made no sense at all. There was industrial activity on a scale that should have been impossible for such a young species, with energy signatures blazing from every human world. Like small suns being born in the darkness, entire asteroid belts were disappearing, consumed by mining operations that worked without rest, and planets were being reshaped by forces that Union technology could not identify. "They are building something," reported senior observer Yenax to the Council of Elders. "Something very large, and we cannot determine what it is." The council was not pleased to hear this, because the quarantine was supposed to keep primitive species contained and controlled, not give them privacy to do whatever they wished. A scout ship was dispatched, small and fast and equipped with the best stealth technology the Union possessed, sent to slip past the human border and gather intelligence. The scout made it 3 light years into human space before it encountered a mining operation that stretched across an entire solar system. Massive structures floated in the darkness, connected by cables of light that pulsed with energy, and ships moved between them in patterns that suggested perfect coordination, like cells in a living body all working toward a single purpose. The scout captain stared at his screens and felt cold fear crawling through his blood, because this was not the primitive industry of a backward species struggling to survive. This was something else entirely. Then his sensors screamed a warning, and a human ship appeared out of nowhere, dropping out of some form of travel that the scout's instruments could not identify or explain. It was a small ship, barely larger than the scout itself, but it moved with a speed and grace that made the captain's mandibles click in shock. A human face appeared on his communication screen, and it belonged to a young woman with dark hair and darker eyes, who spoke in a voice as cold as the space between stars. "You are not welcome here," she said. "This is your only warning." The captain tried to explain that he was on a peaceful mission of observation, that he meant no harm, that the Union simply wanted to understand what humanity was doing. The woman's expression did not change. "We know exactly what the Union wants," she said. "You want to watch us struggle. You want to see us fail. You want to wait until we come begging for your help so you can feel superior and grant U.S. scraps from your table." She leaned closer to the camera, and her eyes were like black holes that swallowed light. "We will never beg. We will never ask for your help. And we will never forget what you said to us in that chamber." The communication ended, and the scout captain ordered an immediate retreat, pushing his engines harder than regulations allowed because something about that woman's eyes had touched a primal fear he did not know he possessed. His report was sealed. At the highest level of classification, the Council of Elders read it in silence. And for the first time in 800,000 years, they did not know what to do. Trade Representative Calax was called before them to give his assessment. And he stood trembling in the same chamber where Ambassador Vasquez had smiled and walked away 23 years ago. "What are they building?" Varax demanded, his crystal branches dark with displeasure. "What is happening in human space?" Calax spread his forearms in a gesture of helplessness. "We do not know, honored elder. And every attempt to gather more information has failed." "Then guess." Another elder commanded. Calax was silent for a long moment, thinking about everything he had seen and heard and read about the strange species called humanity. "I believe," he said finally, "that they are building something to prove us wrong, to show us and themselves that they did not need our approval, that they did not need our technology, that they did not need anything from us at all." "That is foolish," Varax declared. "No species can advance without Union knowledge and Union resources." "Perhaps," Calax said quietly, "but humans have always been foolish. And sometimes the foolish accomplish things that the wise cannot imagine." The council dismissed him with angry words, but his answer stayed with them like a splinter lodged beneath the skin. The quarantine zone that was meant to contain humanity had become a wall that humanity was building from the inside. And behind that wall, something was growing. In the darkness, something that the galaxy was not ready to see. Something that would change everything the Galactic Union had ruled the Milky Way for 1,000,000 years by knowing everything about everyone, by controlling the flow of technology and resources and information so completely that no species could rise without their permission. But in the silence of human space, in the darkness behind the wall, that perfect control was crumbling, and the Union did not even realize it yet. 50 years had passed since Ambassador Vasquez walked out of the Grand Conclave, and the galaxy had learned to live with the mystery of human space, like a person learns to live with a locked door in their own house. Then the Wraith came, and everything changed. They arrived from the void between galaxies, from the empty darkness where no stars shine and no life should exist, pouring into the Milky Way like black water flooding through a broken dam. The first colony they touched simply vanished, and when Union ships arrived to investigate, they found nothing but dust and silence where 3 billion people had lived and worked and dreamed. The second colony sent the distress signal that lasted 47 seconds before cutting off in the middle of a scream. By the time the Union understood what was happening, 17 worlds had already died. The Wraith were not truly alive in any way that galactic science could understand, but they were not purely machines either, and they existed in the terrible space between those two things like a nightmare given physical form. Their ships were grown from the materials of conquered worlds, shaped by processes that changed and adapted faster than any defense could counter. And their hunger was absolute and endless and patient as stone. The Galactic Union mobilized everything. 10,000 years of military development was brought to bear against the invaders, with weapons that could crack planets and shields that could stop stars and ships that moved through dimensions that most species could not perceive. It was not enough. The Wraith learned from every battle, adapted to every weapon, grew stronger with every world they consumed. And the Union's proud fleets began to shatter. Like glass thrown against iron, Elder Varax stood in the war chamber of the Grand Conclave, watching holographic displays show the slow death of everything he had protected for so long. And he felt something he had not experienced in 600,000 years. He felt despair. "We are losing," said Admiral Kethras, the supreme commander of Union military forces, whose scales had turned gray with stress and exhaustion. "Every tactic we try works once and then fails. Every weapon we deploy is countered within days. And they are pushing toward the core faster than our projections predicted. What options remain? Varax asked. Though he already knew the answer. None that can save us, Kethros admitted. We can slow them. We can make them bleed for every light year they take. But in the end, they will reach the core and everything will be lost. The war chamber was silent, except for the soft hum of machines, showing the deaths of civilizations in real time. Then a junior officer spoke. A young being of the Talari species, whose people had been among the first conquered by the Wraith. What about the humans? She asked quietly. Every eye in the room turned to look at her. And she trembled but did not back down. They have been building something for 50 years. She continued. They have technology we do not understand. And they have refused all contact with the Union during that time. But perhaps now, faced with extinction, they might be willing to help. Varax made a sound that was almost a laugh but held no joy. The humans, he said. We rejected them. We humiliated them. We told them they were primitive savages unworthy of our company. Why would they possibly help us now? Because they will die too if the Wraith win, Kethros said slowly, his tactical mind already working through the possibilities. Their space lies in the path of the invasion, and whatever they have built will mean nothing if the galaxy falls. We do not even know if they have anything useful, another elder argued. They were a young and backward species when we last saw them. 50 years is a long time, the Talari officer said. And humans have always been unpredictable. The debate continued for hours, with voices rising and falling like waves against a shore. But in the end, desperation won over pride. A message was sent to the borders of human space. A formal request from the Galactic Union asking for a meeting to discuss the Wraith threat. The response came within hours, which was itself remarkable, since humans had ignored every communication for 5 decades. The border will be open for Union vessels fleeing the Wraith, the message said. Your envoy may proceed to coordinates provided for discussion. Ambassador Velax was chosen for the mission. A skilled diplomat who had negotiated with 100 species and never failed to reach agreement. And she traveled to the edge of human space with a small escort and a heavy heart. What she found there made her forget. Everything she had planned to say the border was indeed open. But it was not undefended. Human ships waited in formations that stretched across her entire sensor range. And they were unlike anything in the Union's databases. Massive angular vessels covered in technology that made Valax's instruments produce readings she could not interpret. Her escort ship's captain sent her nervous messages, asking if they should retreat. But Velax ordered them to hold position and wait. A holographic figure appeared on her bridge. And Velax recognized the face from historical records. It was Admiral Wei Chun, who had been a young patrol captain during the rejection 50 years ago, and whose name had appeared in classified reports about the scout ship incident 27 years later. She was older now, her face lined with years and her hair streaked with gray. But her eyes were the same dark wells that the scout captain had described in his terrified report. I am Fleet Admiral Chun, she said, and her voice carried the weight of someone who had spent decades preparing for this exact moment. We know about the Wraith. We have been watching them since they entered the galaxy. Velax gathered her composure and spoke with all the diplomatic skill she possessed. Then you understand the danger we all face. And surely you see that only by working together can we hope to survive this threat. Admiral Chun's expression did not change. You may pass through our space to reach the galactic core, she said. We will not stop your fleets from retreating. And we will not hinder your evacuation efforts. But will you not help us? Velax asked, hearing the desperation creep into her own voice. Will you not fight alongside us against this enemy? The Admiral was quiet for a long moment. And when she spoke, her voice was as cold as the space between stars. 50 years ago. Your council told Ambassador Vasquez that humanity was not part of your galaxy, that we were primitive savages who should be grateful for the scraps you allowed us to have. She leaned forward slightly, and her eyes burned with something that might have been anger or might have been satisfaction. We have respected your judgment. We have stayed in our quarantine zone and built our own future without your help or your approval. And now you come to us asking for salvation. Please, Velax whispered. Abandoning all pretense of diplomatic pride, billions will die. Civilizations that have existed for millions of years will be erased. Surely you cannot stand by and watch that happen. Admiral Chun nodded slowly. Yes, she said. They will die, and we will watch. Because that is what you taught us to do when you watched us struggle and told us we were not worthy of compassion. The hologram flickered and began to fade. Wait, Velax cried out. At least tell me why. Tell me what we did that was so terrible you would condemn the entire galaxy to die. Admiral Chum paused, and for just a moment something like sadness crossed her weathered face. You did not condemn us to die, she said quietly. You condemned us to be nothing, to be forgotten, to never matter. And that was worse than death. The hologram vanished, and Velax was left alone with the silence and the stars and the terrible knowledge that humanity's answer was no. The Galactic Union had asked for help, and humanity had turned its back on them. Just as they had once turned their backs on humanity, the Wraith continued their advance, and the galaxy continued to burn. And in the darkness of human space, the Great Fleet waited and watched and remembered every word that had been spoken in that chamber 50 years ago. The Union had wanted humanity to beg. Now the Union was begging instead, and humanity was not listening. The war against the Wraith went from bad to catastrophic in the span of 18 months. Union fleets that had stood undefeated for 10,000 years were torn apart in battles that lasted hours. And the greatest warships ever built by galactic civilization became food for the growing swarm. Elder Verax watched world after world go dark on his displays, each one representing billions of lives and millions of years of culture and history erased in moments. And he felt his ancient body growing weaker as his spirit broke beneath the weight of so much death. The Wraith had reached the inner systems now, consuming industrial worlds that had supplied the Union's war effort. And every ship they destroyed became raw material for more Wraith vessels. It was not a war anymore. It was a harvest. Refugees fled in every direction, cramming onto any vessel that could still fly, desperate to escape the spreading darkness, even if they had nowhere to go. Many of them fled toward human space, because it was the only direction the Wraith had not pushed. And they found something unexpected waiting for them at the border. The humans had prepared for them. Massive stations floated at the edge of human territory, and automated systems guided the refugee ships to designated landing zones on barren moons and empty asteroids that had been transformed into basic but functional camps. There was food and water and shelter and medical care, all provided without charge or obligation. And the human workers who operated these stations were efficient and professional, and completely silent on the question of whether humanity would ever join the fight. Why do they help the refugees, but not the war? Asked Counselor Medax, one of the few surviving members of the Union government. It makes no sense. Perhaps they are not as heartless as we believed, said Kellax, the old trade representative who had risen to become an advisor in these desperate times. Perhaps they can hate our government while still feeling pity for our people. Pity. Metax spat the word like poison. We do not need their pity. We need their ships and their weapons. Then perhaps you should not have told them they were worthless savages. Kellax replied quietly. The counselor had no answer for that months past, and the Wraith pushed ever closer to the galactic core. And the Grand Conclave itself was evacuated as the enemy approached the heart of Union civilization. The Council of Elders was reduced to a handful of survivors huddled on a crippled station that drifted through space with failing life support and dying engines. Varax was the last of the original 7 who had judged humanity 53 years ago, and he knew that he would not survive much longer, regardless of whether the Wraith found him. He asked to make one final broadcast, and the others agreed because there was nothing left to lose. His image was transmitted across every frequency still functioning in the galaxy, reaching ships and stations and camps and whatever hidden places still held survivors of the Great Collapse. I speak to you as the last voice of the Galactic Union, Varax said, and his crystal branches had grown dark and brittle with age and grief. I speak to confess our sins before the end comes. He paused, gathering strength that he did not truly have 60 years ago. A young species came before us, asking only for the chance to prove themselves. And we looked at them with contempt and told them they were nothing. His voice cracked, a sound like ice breaking in a frozen river. We were wrong, not just about their worth, but about everything we believed made us superior. And now our pride has destroyed us. He looked directly into the camera, knowing that somewhere in human space, his words might be heard by the people he had wronged so long ago. To humanity, I say this: we do not ask for salvation because we know we do not deserve it. We ask only that you remember we existed, that someone in the universe remembers the civilizations that rose and fell before the Wraith came. He bowed his great crystalline head, and I ask forgiveness, not for the Union, but for myself, for the words I spoke to Ambassador Vasquez in that chamber, for the cruelty I showed to a people whose only crime was being young. The transmission ended, and Varax closed his ancient eyes and waited for death. For 3 days, the galaxy held its breath. The Wraith continued their advance. The refugees continued their desperate flight, and humanity remained silent behind its wall of ships and secrets. Then, on the 4th day, every screen in every corner of the galaxy lit up with the same image. A human woman stood alone in a vast observation chamber, and behind her a fleet of ships stretched toward the horizon. Thousands upon thousands of vessels, larger and more powerful than anything the Union had ever built. She was middle-aged, with short black hair and eyes that held both steel and sorrow. And she wore a simple uniform without decoration or rank insignia. "My name is President Yuki Tanaka," she said. And her voice was calm and clear and carried across light years to reach every ear that could still hear. 60 years ago, your council told Ambassador Elena Vasquez that humanity was not worthy of your galaxy, that we were too young and too primitive and too savage to deserve a place among civilized species. She paused, and the camera pulled back to show more of the fleet behind her. Ships that hummed with power that made sensors across the galaxy scream in confusion. "You were right," she continued. "We were not worthy of your galaxy, not because we were weak, but because your galaxy was built on lies and cruelty, and the belief that power gives you the right to decide who matters." The view shifted again, showing the fleet beginning to move, engines flaring to life like stars being born. "So we built our own," President Tanaka said. "We spent 60 years in silence, building ships and weapons and technology that you cannot understand because we created it without your rules and your limitations and your assumptions about what is possible." Her expression hardened, and her voice took on an edge that could cut through steel. "We built it in the darkness you forced us into, and we built it with the knowledge that someday we would need it. Not to prove ourselves to you, but to prove something to ourselves." She stepped forward, and her eyes seemed to look directly at every person watching across the galaxy. "We are coming," she said. "Not because you asked, not because you begged, not because we have forgiven you for what you did, but because there are innocent people dying, and children crying, and refugees huddled in our camps, wondering if they will ever see their homes again. She took a deep breath. We are human. And humans do not stand by while the helpless suffer. No matter what those helpless ones did to us in the past. The camera pulled back one final time to show the full scale of the human fleet. A wall of ships moving toward the war zone like a wave of iron and fire. The Galactic Union told us we were savages. President Tanaka said, they told us we would never matter. They told us our only future was to serve and beg and be grateful for scraps. Her smile was sharp as a blade and cold as deep space. They were wrong about everything except one thing. We are exactly as dangerous as they feared. And now the galaxy will see what happens when humanity stops holding back. The transmission ended, and across the dying galaxy, for the first time in 3 years, people began to hope again. The human fleet did not fight the way the Galactic Union had fought. And the Wraith discovered this truth in the first hour of contact when their advanced forces met the human vanguard in a system called Broken Star by the refugees who had fled through it. Union tactics had been built on overwhelming force and established doctrine, on using superior numbers and firepower to crush enemies through sheer weight of metal and energy. The humans fought like nothing the galaxy had ever seen. Their ships moved in patterns that seemed random until suddenly the pattern became clear, and 100 Wraith vessels were caught in crossfire from directions they had not known existed. Their weapons did not simply destroy but corrupted, firing beams of something that was not quite light and not quite matter that made Wraith ships turn against each other as their adaptive systems went mad, trying to process information that could not exist. Their tactics changed by the hour, never repeating, never following predictable patterns, responding to Wraith adaptations. Before the adaptations were complete, Admiral Chun commanded the Vanguard fleet from her flagship, the Vasquez, named for an ambassador who had died 15 years ago. Still believing that humanity would someday prove the Union wrong, she watched her screens show the dance of death playing out across the system. And she spoke commands in a voice that never wavered, even as ships died and captains fell. Squadron 7. Execute pattern autumn wind. Squadron 12. Hold position until the Wraith commit their reserves. All ships remember your training and trust your crews. The Wraith were not prepared for enemies who fought without fear, who sacrificed ships willingly to achieve objectives that seemed meaningless until the cascade effects became clear, who treated death as a tactical option rather than something to be avoided at all costs. In the Battle of Broken Star, the human fleet destroyed 4,000 Wraith vessels and lost only 600 of their own, a ratio that should have been impossible against an enemy that had crushed every fleet the Union sent against them. The survivors of the Union watched from their hidden places and their refugee camps and their crippled stations, and they wept with emotions they could not name, hope and shame and awe, and something that might have been the beginning of respect. The war turned at the siege of Kellara Prime. Human Marines boarded a Wraith command node and captured it intact, giving humanity's scientists their first clear look at how the enemy thought and adapted. Within weeks, new weapons were deployed that targeted the very processes that made Wraith adaptation possible, forcing them to choose between evolution and survival at the liberation of the Ven cluster. A human dreadnought named the Armstrong executed a maneuver that physicists across the galaxy swore was impossible, folding space in ways that Union science said could not be done, appearing inside the Wraith formation and detonating a weapon that existed in dimensions the Wraith could not perceive. 300 Wraith capital ships simply ceased to exist, erased from reality by forces that the universe had not known were possible. The Wraith began to retreat, and for the first time since they had emerged from the void, they showed something that looked almost like fear. Admiral Chun pursued them without mercy, driving them back system by system, world by world, refusing to give them time to regroup or rebuild or adapt to humanity's ever-changing tactics at the Battle of the Veiled Nebula. The largest engagement in galactic history. The human fleet faced the concentrated might of everything the Wraith had left. It should have been a slaughter, with the Wraith outnumbering the humans nearly 10-1. Instead, it became a masterpiece of warfare that military historians would study for millennia. Admiral Chun's flagship led the charge directly into the heart of the Wraith formation, heading straight for the hive mind node that coordinated their entire species. Everyone watching believed she was sacrificing herself, throwing her ship away in a final desperate act. They were wrong. The Vasquez's engines were not driving the ship forward, but charging a weapon that human scientists had been building for 30 years. A device that manipulated reality itself in ways that the creators did not fully understand. When the weapon fired, it did not destroy the hive mind node. It made the node forget what it was. The Wraith did not just die in that moment. They unraveled, coming apart as the connections that held them together dissolved into nothing. And the greatest threat the galaxy had ever faced became dust and silence in the space of a heartbeat. Admiral Chun survived, though her ship was crippled and her crew was halved. And her first words after the battle were simple and quiet. That was for Elena, the Wraith. Remnants fled toward the intergalactic void, chased by human vessels that would not stop until the last trace of the enemy was erased from existence. The final transmission detected from the fleeing Wraith was a sound that Union scientists could not identify, but every human who heard it recognized it instantly. It was a scream of terror, the sound of something ancient and terrible finally meeting something more terrible than itself. The war was over, the galaxy was saved, and now came the harder part. The Council of Elders was rebuilt from survivors of the old government and representatives of species who had lost everything in the war, and they requested a meeting with human leadership to discuss the future president. Tanaka arrived at the rebuilt Grand Conclave Station with an honor guard of ships that could have destroyed everything in the system. But she came alone into the great chamber where Ambassador Vasquez had been judged 60 years before. The gathered representatives of 1,000 species looked at her with something new in their eyes, something that had not been there when they looked at Elena Vasquez so long ago. Fear and respect and desperate hope for forgiveness. Elder Varax was there, kept alive by machines that hummed with Union technology. And he spoke first with a voice that crackled with age and guilt. President Tanaka, on behalf of the Galactic Union and all the species we represent, we offer our deepest thanks for the salvation you have brought us. He bowed his crystal head, something that elders did not do for anyone. We offer you full membership in the Union, a permanent seat on the Council of Elders, and any other honor you wish to claim, because nothing we can give will ever repay what humanity has done. President Tanaka listened in silence, her face showing nothing of what she felt inside. When Varax finished speaking, she was quiet for a long moment. 60 years ago, she said finally, you looked at Ambassador Vasquez and saw vermin. You looked at humanity and saw savages unworthy of your attention. And you rejected us not because of what we were, but because of what you feared we might become. She stepped forward, and her eyes met Varax's ancient gaze without flinching. You were right to be afraid. The chamber was utterly silent. We will help rebuild what was lost. President Tanaka continued. We will defend this galaxy from whatever comes next. We will be neighbors and perhaps someday friends, because that is who we choose to be. Her voice hardened. But we will never join your union as members begging for approval. We will never sit in council chambers where our worth is judged by those who prove they cannot be trusted with that power. And we will never forget the lesson we learned in those 60 years of silence. She turned to face the gathered representatives of 1,000 species. The lesson was this. We were always enough. We never needed your approval to become what we are. And humanity's greatest strength was forged in the moment. You told us we were worthless, and we chose to believe in ourselves instead. She walked toward the exit, just as Elena Vasquez had walked 60 years ago. But this time she paused at the door and looked back. You built a galaxy on the belief that some species matter more than others, that the young must beg for scraps from the old. That power gives you the right to decide who is worthy. Her smile was sad but not cruel. We built something different in our 60 years of darkness. We built a future where worth is not given by those above, but earned by those who dare to try. And we hope that someday you will learn to build the same. She left. The galaxy was saved, the Union endured, and humanity took its place among the stars. Not as beggars granted scraps, but as equals who had earned their seat at the table the hard way, by building their own table and leaving a seat open for anyone willing to sit beside them as true equals. The universe was vast and dark and full of dangers yet unknown. But humanity had learned that the darkness was not something to fear, it was something to build in, and they had 60 years of practice the end.